We are again discussing the Mount Hagen Wildlife Management Area and its treatment efforts that we focused on. This is just south of Anaconda, Montana, on the Superfund site. We're going to start with the California Creek drainage. It's kind of that willow bottom you can see along the bottom of the screen, and the whole creek drainage. The creek drains the majority of the Mount Hagen property on the south side of the Continental Divide, south and east, I suppose. But the issues on site we're having are large sediment contributions from these bare upper slopes, unvegetated, very friable soil. It's volcanic ash. Any sort of moving water just scours right down through it. And it has resulted in a creek system that is incredibly incised, large gully and rill formations, and essentially devoid of any functional riparian or floodplain habitat. So we've done a variety of techniques and implementation projects focusing on stabilizing upland slopes, trying to reconnect the floodplain hydrology with the incised channel, with different sorts of beaver structures and check dams. So we're going to start at the bottom of the drainage and work our way up. This is where we can see some of the more drastic changes. Our efforts have kind of terminated at this large willow complex that you see the cursor scrolling over. So right around this area we implemented a large restoration effort around beaver dam installations. These are essentially small leaky dams that we build directly into the creek channel in an effort to slow the water velocity, increase the local water table, raise the local water table, trap sediment behind, and bring the bottom grade of the channel closer to the floodplain to increase the floodplain connectivity. You can see the biggest contributing sediment issue is at the bottom of the California uplands. This is a large sediment plume. Actually, this is all buried under approximately 4 to 5 feet of volcanic tuff, and it's bare because it's a soil type that is essentially inert, doesn't carry any nutrient value, so it's very difficult to establish vegetation. So right off the bat, we ended up installing large planting exclosures to put some 1 gallon containerized plants, as well as to protect volunteer and pre-established vegetation from any ungulate browse. So if you flip to the more recent image, you can see some of these exclosures. These lines are just fencing in some aspen clumps, some willow clumps, some plantings that we installed on site. We dealt with the issues of the sediment contribution up that drainage with some engineered structures and earthen basins, as well as some fertilization and seeding trials. However, the most dramatic effects we've seen have been directly in the creek channel itself. Back to an older image, you can see the vegetation has developed quite a bit since then, and it's also visible in that older in this current image, that the channel has widened and become more shallow. So this part right along the cursor, these are all planting nets, so you can kind of see the scale of the efforts. This is approximately 20 feet wide, and if you go to the older image, you can see that the channel used to be only about 3 feet wide. So by installing these beaver dams, we're backing up the water. We're allowing sediment to drop out of the water column. It's building up. It's actually regrading the channel, widening the floodplain, having an incredible local effect on the vegetation. We're seeing a lot more emergent wetland communities such as sedges and rushes. The willows are having a field day with the higher water table. And a little further up the stream, you can actually see the effects of what we've been doing to reestablish the floodplain. Right on this image, you can see some of our bigger beaver dam structures. This is an attempt to catch the water as it's coming through the channel and spread it out across the landscape. This grade, kind of the grade that we're looking at, is essentially a flat sedge meadow. It had a little bit of an incised channel, and we just want to flood that meadow to essentially engender, additional beaver colonization. This was a historic beaver dam site. So in this current image from 2016, you can see our structures every 20 to 50 feet going up the creek. And what that has done in the past years is actually move the channel. So when you go back to 2013, you can see that the creek itself came swooping across the meadow and went slamming into this slope across on the south end. And then when we ended up working here, installing some of those beaver dams, what happened is the sediment backed up, and we found ourselves with a new channel alteration. It filled in and found the new path of least resistance, which resulted in braiding the channel. We still have this old secondary subchannel that receives flow during peak events, but now we have this new channel that's changing the hydrology of the landscape, keeping it on the landscape longer as it's no longer in that incised channel, and it's resulted in this large, wet, sedgy complex right at the base of this large sediment plume. So the effects can be pretty significant over a short period of time, just because we're dealing with so much sediment loading in the channel that it can actually pretty quickly regrade itself and come back up to the floodplain elevation. So our efforts on this stretch of the California Creek stop right by the roadside. The property owners are, changed from public to private. So our efforts stopped right past this culvert, and the creek actually continues across the road. You can see for a short stretch, this is a private land ownership, so we haven't been able to work on this property just yet. But it picks up right as it jumps back into the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks management area. So here you can see this is a pretty incised reach of the creek. The property line is actually right there, so we haven't been able to work that incised creek. But we started right here and picked up where we left off, installing more beaver dams and more willow cuttings for revegetation, trying to get some more woody vegetation to establish. And this is an image from 2016, and you can see the creek. The scale of this image, the creek is probably about, in these wider sections, it's probably about 12, maybe 14 feet wide. But if you go back just a couple years to 2013, you can see that it wasn't nearly as wide, especially in some of these tighter sections. We've at least doubled the width of the channel, and that's a direct result of the sediment that's backing up behind these structures, leveling out that incised channel, regrading it, bringing it higher up towards the floodplain. And anecdotally, there are definitely visible vegetative changes on the site. We're seeing a lot more wetland species, the rushes, the sedges popping up. We're seeing springs popping out of the ground where we haven't noticed them before. Another interesting tidbit of information that we've noticed is the ground mammals, the burrowing squirrels and voles, have begun excavating their channels and their tunnels directly into the bank of the channels. And we reason that this is because as we're raising the water table just a few inches to maybe half a foot in some places, it's flooding their tunnels. And in an effort to drain their tunnels, they're actually creating new ones, almost like a French drain, back into the creek. So that's an anecdotal tidbit of information that we haven't been able to prove on any sort of scale, but it's an interesting response to a localized issue. So the efforts continue all the way up the drainage, go all the way up to this narrow ravine where we're seeing a lot more aspen and willow regeneration. Ungulate pressure is always an issue, but this is a wildlife management area, so it's nothing that we can't embrace. You see more of our structures here starting to brown. It's mostly lodgepole needle, which acts as a great fine sediment capture as it packs in behind the dams. Some of these stretches of creek, you can't really tell by these images, and even from the older sections, they're pretty narrow, but they're not a shallow. It's not a shallow section. In some places you're 4 feet below the surface of the floodplain. And in an area like this, where just across the road we see historic beaver dams that go on for a half a mile, this is a pretty mellow grade, and it should be a very wet drainage. There should be lots of willows, and there just isn't. It's all been filled in or eroded away. So as we're coming up drainage, you can see we start picking up. We have a little bit more of the density of the beaver structures. And this is a site actually of particular interest where it's very flat, it's very broad, very low slope. It's obviously an ideal spot to engender a new floodplain or develop the floodplain or even increase the floodplain. So as you're standing back, we have a big wet patch, and there's lots of seeps and springs in all this area. It's a large drainage, it's a big drainage area. So we see these wet patches, and even up here we know there's lots of groundwater. It's squishy as you walk through it. It's not hiding. It's just that it's leaving the landscape too quickly. So what we're trying to do is to slow it down. So you can see here the creek actually has two channels. One goes up kind of the east and south flank, and one goes up the west or northern flank. And the northern flank is actually an old sub-channel that we've reconnected. So as you go up the drainage a little bit further, you'll see where they meet up right about here. And this was a crucial part, and this is where we're really learning about development of these techniques. When you go back in time, you see the channel is very clearly all the way along that right flank, and it does not stray. And you can see the old channel, and I assume in high peak events that it was an active channel. But it's a very bare spot. The water just runs off the landscape, taking whatever sediment it wants with it. So what we did up here is if we zoom in right there, and this is a very important structure. This one little structure, he's the corner piece, the keystone of the whole thing. What happened when we put a log across that creek, we built a beaver dam, and it filled in immediately, within weeks after a rain event. And as we came back, we just laid a log across the top of it. So any water coming down that creek filled in. Lots of it still perked through and overtopped and went down to the main channel, but a significant amount started meandering through and carved a little bit of its own new path right along here, and it ended up in this little patch. And right at the end of this slope are some aspen, and over the course of just a year or two, we've seen quite a large increase in the aspen regeneration. So you can see it again one more time. Pretty barren, a few patches of green, and all of a sudden it's really establishing more. The other thing that's great about this is it's keeping the water on the landscape more. I mean, you can see right there that there is a strip of green following that channel, which was not there before. So right away you can tell that there are changes happening on the landscape. And in 40 years, when everything's fixed itself with Mother Nature and our efforts working together, we may see a willow complex here and eventual beaver dams. So here you can see another large plume coming up a channel. We've done some slashing work up here to try to reduce sediment contribution, slow the water down, but our efforts have still focused on the channel itself. More beaver dams all the way up through this section. Another one here. There's probably about 250 beaver dams in this creek. You can see this is a very nice wet seep. It comes right out of this hillside. This is an especially wet seep as well. So we're just trying to slow the water down as it's coming down this landscape. If we go up further, you see more rilling, just contributing more sediment. This is where we focus on a lot of structures. Right here we see a really interesting piece. So if we zoom in, this is the main channel. You can see a bunch of junk in the channel. It's really a lot of slash. We've had a really significant impact at this one site. You can't tell from this image very well, but this channel right here, this reach of the channel was incised about 5 feet. Actually more. It was probably about 6 feet because it was overhead. We built two structures right in front of this dead lodgepole, and then about 30 feet down the creek. And what happened was it filled in with about 4 feet of sediment above the two structures. It actually stopped a head cut from proceeding up the slope. We had this beautiful wet kind of pool develop and a little bit of vegetation established, so we figured we'd build upon it. We have images of this, of close-ups, on the ground images. It's actually a nice photo point, but we decided to build up on it, so we added as much slash as we could muster to try to get that to come back up to grade. We're trying to see if we can still get enough sediment contribution, and by importing materials, and this is all local materials, we're just cutting the dead standing beetle kill pine and kind of throwing it in the creek, and it actually kind of reinforces the banks and has some hard material so that the water can't scour through the parent material and kind of the soft friable bedrock as well. So this is an interesting piece of project. We're going to keep our eye close on that for the years to come. More efforts go all the way up the creek. More beaver dams, more log checks, more rock checks. We're seeing some cool vegetation establish. I'm swooping around. And here's another target site. If you zoom in here, this is a big old bend, outer bend. This slope was actually eroding pretty significantly. Another 6-7 foot grade difference between the surrounding slope and the bottom of the channel. So along here, another, can't tell too well, but we ended up doing more brush fascine, so bundling lodgepole limbs and poles and fastening them to the toe of that bank. Any material sloughing off that bank is caught in those brush fascines, and it's actually already starting to establish vegetation. The fireweed takes pretty well to those sort of pioneer sites. More willow and lodgepole beaver dam structures throughout this bend. We've got a pretty significant amount of structures right along here. We've got another wet seep and an old channel. We've got another spring right here. There's a third spring coming in, so there's a lot of water confluencing right at this site. This is a very interesting dam we built. It's got another 2 or 3 feet of sediment back behind it. It's nearly at grade with the surrounding topography. And this is where things get really ugly. Right above us, following the cursor, the channel becomes incredibly incised, in some places up to 30 feet. And this is strictly because the vegetation was removed, deforestation happened for the logging purposes for the smelter, and then there was nothing holding it back, and so it just scoured right through the parent material. The bedrock you can almost snap in half, a piece of it with your hand. It's so friable. And you can see some of our structures get pretty significant. Down here we've got a lot of slash, and this is just an attempt to fill the structures. But this is the old image, lots of white. We're starting to get a little bit more vegetation. More brush fascines up along this bank. More slashing. These structures are significantly bigger than the beaver dams we've been building. This was actually about 12 feet tall. Hasn't filled in very much. We attribute it to the fact that we're not getting as much of a water velocity and volume coming down the rills as we've slashed and filled in a lot of these trenches. This is the issue right here. At the moment we're working on keeping the sediment from washing down the creek, but the ultimate goal is to reestablish these uplands to prevent it from entering the creek in the first place. But in the meantime, you gotta make a few efforts at blocking it as it's going to come down in the process of working the land. So this is the upper extent of the California Creek project. As you can see, there's no shortage of bare, unvegetated areas. As a whole, I believe we've treated 2 miles of California Creek and its surrounding uplands. There's plenty more work to do, but it's a very interesting project as we see a lot of localized ecological trends bouncing back, responding to the changes in water table, changes in the hydrology, and a general increase in living matter and greenery as a whole. It's very, very rewarding, very, very encouraging signs. So, I don't have anything else.
Do you want, just real quick, you had mentioned kind of in other spots where there's a good existing beaver dam.
Yeah, exactly. So, we're still at California Creek, and I wanted to show you a reach stream, a reference stream. This is literally right down the road. As you can see, this is the project scope. Project here, this whole stretch of California. You come about half a mile around the bend. These are good friends of ours. We stay at their lodge quite often. As you zoom in, this is what California Creek should resemble. You've got a lot of willows, you've got a lot of clumps, woody vegetation. What happens is this site wasn't as severely impacted for some reason or another, and this is actually an image that's a few years old. I'm going to zoom ahead.
Drag it all the way to the right.
This is the most recent image. We're starting to see ponding. Pond, 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 pond. You go upstream, large ponds. This is what we need. This is beaver activity. What's happening is this site was suitable for beavers to establish their dams only because there was a existing willow population, willow habitat. So the beaver dams are an excellent form of natural mitigation for the eroding uplands, as it allows the water to settle out, collect, pool. It actually is self-grading as the sediment enters in. It fills in the pond and only allows the pond to expand wider and wider along its fringes. So this is a reference stream. We've been using it to visualize what we would hope California would look like. It comes back down and it meets up with the main stem of California, and you can see it's a much more meandering stream. We see lots of outer bends, we see lots of willows, we see lots of oxbows and sinuosity. As you follow up the reference portion, and you can see how broad this floodplain is. As you follow it upstream, all of a sudden it gets to our project extent right around the bend, and it becomes very tapered and essentially disappears in terms of the willow complex, and the stream gets very narrow, very channelized, to the worst cases up here where we see just white. What's happened here, and this is an interesting tidbit, is this is a perennial stream. As we notice, just a mile down slope, there's still water in the stream. However, here there is no water, and what's happened is this is filled in with sediment and forced the water to go subterranean, where it pops out in springs and seeps elsewhere, and it doesn't resurface until about, I believe, right about there, where the water finally comes back up and becomes perennial again. And we're seeing in an upper reach, and I'll show you, it's a little bit up the road, right about there. When we first started the project, we didn't have water in July past this spot where the cursor is, and only a year or two later we're seeing water make it all the way to there. That's a whole 1,500 feet further down the drainage before it goes subterranean. So we're seeing signs of the water staying on the landscape longer, it's infiltrating, the hydrology is becoming more perennial. One day, ideally, this might become a fish-bearing stream again, but it has a long way to go before it can support a fish population.